So the topic today, of course, is something that is very much on all of our minds. It is the applicability of the principle of force majeure to the present crisis. And I think that there has been a lot of discussion in academic circles, of course, as to what is force majeure, when does it apply, in what circumstances can we make it applicable, what are the rights and liabilities of the parties to a contract when it comes to force majeure. But today we're going to take a slightly different approach. We're going to look at it from a purely practical point of view. We're going to examine how does force majeure affect certain types of agreements that all of us through the course of our businesses or through the course of our practice encounter on a day-to-day basis. So of course, thanks with a lot of help from the Law Point team and with very little help from my side, we prepared a presentation. So I'll just get that on the screen right now. I hope everybody can see it. And so basically through this presentation, we're just going to take a look at the basic concept of force majeure. And then we're going to look at how it is applicable to various types of contracts that are likely to be affected by it. So let's start with the first segment, understanding the legal concept of force majeure. So, of course, force majeure, as you can imagine, is a French term. It means a superior force that cannot be resisted. So, from what I could understand, people have managed to trace back this term to the year 1690, when it was first used in the legal context. Now, it is another way of putting it, and which we can see in many contracts, is used as a phrase "act of God." So act of God and force majeure are used interchangeably. They both refer to certain scenarios which are outside the control of the parties to the contract, and which you may or may not render the contract incapable of performance. So that is what force majeure is in a very general term. Now, let's first start with common law, because as we all know, our Contract Act as well as several aspects of our civil law, they do arise from common law. So let's look at how force majeure started in the common law context. The basic principle of any contract, and one which was recognized in common law, is that a party has to be bound by their contractual obligation. So once a party makes a promise and the promise is accepted by the promisee and reciprocal promises are made and a contract is formed, then each party will remain bound by the terms of that contract. That is something that is recognized by our Contract Act too, which says in, I believe, section 36, we'll take a look at that, which says very clearly that once a party has made a promise, they have to comply with that promise, of course, subject to the exceptions in the act itself. Now, one of the earliest common law exceptions, of course, to this basic obligation to perform your activities under a contract or to abide by the promise, is in case the promiser died. Now, not obviously, you can imagine not every instance of the promiser passing away will result in the contract being declared as having come to an end. For example, if a person takes a loan from a bank and then subsequently passes away, the obligation to repay that loan, of course, will not go away. That particular obligation will thereafter be enforced against the estate of the person, the estate of the deceased. But on the other hand, you can imagine there would be some type of contractual relationships or some type of contracts that involve an obligation that is so personal that it may not be able to be enforced against the state, or rather that it should not be enforced against the state. For example, if a particular artist is contracted to paint a caricature,
Amir,
and
Amir,
before you,
Amir, one
sorry,
second. Your
yes,
presentation is getting stuck. There are some columns or blocks coming on the sides and everything.
oh, okay, just a second, I don't know why that is the case.
You can press an F5 or
Is it better now?
slightly blocks are still there, but much better.
Much better. Okay, anyway, I'm sure the presentation will be shared later. So again, going back to the example of a caricature. Now, if a person is engaged to produce a caricature, but before he could make the caricature or based on the requirement, he passes away. Now, that is not an obligation, of course, that could be enforced against the estate, because that comes out of something that is very personal to the person who passed away, rather his skill. The contract, the subject matter of the contract in that case is the skill of the person who is to prepare the caricature. And once that goes away, there's of course no way of holding anybody to that contract. Now, this principle was expanded for the first time into what we now recognize as the common law principle of force majeure in the year 1883 by the Queen's Bench in the case of Taylor versus Caldwell. In this particular case, what had happened was a opera house or a music house was to be taken on rent for 3 particular days. And it was promised that the person taking it on hire would, of course, arrange for the entertainment. And the promisor was to make sure that the opera house is available for that purpose. And of course, they would split the proceeds to in a certain ratio. Before the opera house could be taken, a tornado arrived in the city and the opera house was destroyed. The question then arose was whether the damages, whether the person who was to take the opera house on rent could claim damages for the non-availability of it. Justice Blackburn, I believe, he was presiding over the case. He noted the common law exception to the rule of binding nature of contracts about the death of a person. And he said that the ultimate basis for that principle is that some contracts are based on a particular type of subject matter, and or rather they are dependent on that subject matter existing. So once the subject matter goes, in the previous example, once the skill of the person preparing the caricature, or in this example, the opera house that is to be taken on rent, once that subject matter goes, there is no question of the contract being able to be performed. What the Queen's Bench held in that judgment was that every contract has an implied covenant, an implied condition that the subject matter of the contract will continue to subsist. And the moment that the subject matter goes away, then the contract can no longer be binding on the parties. That was the implied covenant that the Queen's Bench found. Over time, of course, of the last 150 odd years, this principle has been refined, honed, but the common thread running through most of the common law judgments was that this was an implied term of the contract itself. And therefore, being an implied term of the contract, it is implied that the parties intended to not be bound by the contract if the basic underlying nature of the contract changes due to an act of God, due to an act beyond the control of the parties. So this is how the British courts and the common law approach this principle. Of course, looking at the position in India and possibly rendering the previous discussion slightly defunct, we have taken a very different approach. As you may note, the concept of force majeure as has been developed in British courts came from that judgment of 1883. But our Indian Contract Act, in fact, precedes that in 1872. And our Indian Contract Act has some provisions relating to impossibility of contract and relating to delayed performance or inability to perform a contract. Now, I recently had the chance to acquire a copy of Frederick Pollock's first edition of, I believe, The Law of Partnership. And in the preface, he made a note that the prevalent thought at that point of time was that the Indian legislation, such as the Indian Contract Act, etc., in fact, the first Code of Civil Procedure of 1859, they were better exponents of common law than the actual common law that existed in England. So to look at it that way, Section 56 of the Contract Act, which is going to be the basic, the fulcrum of our discussion, that exemplifies what many academics and policy makers in Britain wanted common law to be. So in India, we have the concept of force majeure in the Contract Act in Section 56, which talks about impossibility of performance of an agreement. And we will see, of course, that there is a bit of a difference between the common law principle of force majeure and the concept of impossibility under Section 56. Apart from Contract Act, of course, we have force majeure in a few other legislations. Noteworthy recent legislation is, of course, the Real Estate Regulation Act, in which it is specifically noted that force majeure can be a ground for a builder to claim a delay in completing a project. Similarly, the Sale of Goods Act has certain provisions as to when goods cannot be delivered due to an impossibility or a shortage or some other situation of such nature. Specific Relief Act also talks about when when a person will be unable to perform a contract, whether specific relief can be granted, etc. So now let's just directly look at section 56, and with everybody's permission, I'd like to just read through it carefully, because we will see that it's not what we usually think when we hear the term force majeure. Section 56 applies to very specific scenarios. So firstly, we can see that is divided into three specific provisions. Three provisions relating to the same subject matter have been combined, and they make section 56. So the first part, an agreement to do an act impossible in itself is void. And therefore, for that, of course, we can see illustration A. A agrees with B to discover treasure by magic. Naturally, this is something that is impossible. It is not at all possible for either of these parties to actually discover treasure by magic. So the agreement is void ipso facto. Now the second part, contract to do act afterwards becoming impossible or unlawful. A contract to do an act which, after the contract is made, becomes impossible, or by reason of some event which the promisor could not prevent, unlawful, becomes void when the act becomes impossible or unlawful. Now, a couple of things to note here. First, this particular part talks about two eventualities. One, when after the contract has been entered into, it becomes impossible, or two, when it becomes unlawful. Now we can also note that, of course, when we talk about force majeure, we talk about a contract becoming impossible. But what is very interesting is that this particular provision doesn't say that the contract has become impossible because of something out of the control of the promisor. The part of it becoming unlawful is dependent on it becoming unlawful because of something the promisor could not prevent. So for example, if during a contract for export of cotton, suppose the government comes out with an order saying that cotton above a certain quantity can only be exported with a license, and the exporter does not apply for that license. Then the contract of export, of course, has become lawful, but not for a reason that was not that could not have been prevented by the exporter. On the other hand, if, for example, the exporter hires a ship which he is informed that the ship is only capable of taking a particular route, which is a bit more dangerous than other routes, and due to some natural calamity, the ship sinks. If it'll of course go to the facts of the case, but directly, merely because the person had some knowledge that it was possible for the ship to sink on that particular route, does not mean that the contract did not become impossible. So that is one nuance that comes out of this part. Now for this, we can see illustration B. A and B contract to marry each other. Before the time fixed for the marriage, A goes mad. The contract becomes void. So this is something that happens after the contract is entered into. And again, it is noted that the illustration is silent. Of course, the contract has become impossible and possibly also unlawful, but the contract is silent as to whether it could have been prevented or not. Now, the third and last part of section 56 is compensation for loss through non-performance of act known to be impossible or unlawful, where one person has promised to do something which he knew of, or which he knew or with reasonable diligence might have known, and which the promisee did not know to be impossible or unlawful, such promiser must make compensation to such promisee for any loss which such promisee sustains through the non-performance of the promise. Now this is essentially a caveat to the above proposition, which says that nobody can take advantage of a contract becoming impossible if that person had reason to believe that it was likely to become impossible. Of course, otherwise it is a good excuse for somebody to be able to wriggle out of an obligation by saying that now it has become impossible, even though that person may fully well have known that it is likely to become impossible. Or if the person was diligent, then they could have figured out that it in all likelihood would become impossible. Then of course they will have to pay compensation. This is perhaps a species of a misrepresentation, where somebody represented or impliedly represented that they are fully capable of performing the contract without determining that there is an element of impossibility that may arise. So now we can see what is the difference between this section 56 and the common law exposition, and why we should be very hesitant in using common law principles when we evaluate force majeure in the Indian context. So firstly, as I stated earlier, in common law, force majeure is treated as an implied promise that forms part and parcel of the contract. So the parties to a contract, they have an implied promise that in case the subject matter of the contract is lost, or in case there is some supervening circumstance because of which the contract cannot be performed, then the contract becomes void due to impossibility. On the other hand, section 56 prescribes something known as positive law. It is in addition to the contract. It is over and above the contract. It is in fact something that is not part of the contract. It is a statutory protection that if after entering into the contract, its performance becomes impossible, then the contract becomes void from that moment on. So this does not depend on the implied agreement between the parties. In fact, there are judgments which if you go through them, you'll see that the Supreme Court has said that the whole point of section 56 it encompasses something that could not have been envisaged by the parties to the contract, or if it could not have, and of course if it could not have been envisaged by the parties to the contract, then there is no question of the parties having any implied promise to treat the contract as void, because it is something beyond the understanding of the parties. Nobody could have predicted that a pandemic would occur through a mutated flu virus, and yet here we are. So that is not something that the parties could have predict, and that is when section 56 of course comes into effect. And now what is the significance of this distinction between common law and Indian law? Because it may seem that this is a very it may seem like a very technical difference, but the significance of this is that where the parties have agreed, or where the contract between the parties does provide for what will happen in case the unforeseeable happens, the unforeseeable passes, then section 56 will not have an application, because section 56 is meant to apply where the parties could not have foreseen a certain circumstance. In fact, we will, of course, some judgments we will discuss in this presentation, where the Supreme Court has held that if the parties take into account unforeseen circumstances and provide a mechanism for dealing with such circumstances, then section 56 will not have any application. In fact, now let's look at some of those judgments, some very noteworthy judgments which will help us understand the scope of section 56. So in an old judgment of 1968, Nai Jute Mills versus Khaliram Jagannath. Now, this particular case dealt with the supply of jute. Nai Jute Mills was to supply a certain quantity of jute to Khaliram Jagannath, and the contract itself provided for certain ways in which the jute could be supplied. So at that time, it was very popular to import jute from Pakistan because it was cheaper there. So the contract itself in that case provided that the seller, the jute mill, can in fact either import jute from Pakistan and sell it at a certain rate, or they can acquire it from Indian sources and sell it at a certain rate. The contract even provided that if they aren't able to obtain an import license expeditiously, then the performance can be deferred by 6 months. And it also provided that in case they have to supply it from Indian sources, then the rate will increase by a certain amount. Now, in this particular case, they were unable to obtain an import license because the policy for giving import license. So luckily, not much was lost. So getting back to the facts, so in this case, there was a problem with the license. So the jute mill could not obtain the license. They had to procure the jute internally from within India, which cost them a lot more than they anticipated. So they sued for damages. It was under the Arbitration Act 1940. So there's also an ancillary question whether force majeure invalidated an arbitration clause. But the main question was that they said that because the government changed its policy of giving import licenses of jute, they had to procure the jute from local providers at a much higher cost, and that constituted force majeure. It was impossible to import jute from Pakistan, and therefore they wanted compensation. Now, the Supreme Court, of course, it examined the issue at great length. This was one of the first instances where this question came up. They went through the common law. They examined how the concept of force majeure arose in common law. They examined the scope of Section 56. And they, once again, as we discussed earlier, they held that 56 applies as a statutory protection, but it does not apply when the parties had already foreseen the effect of their incapability, or one of the parties' effect of being incapable of performing the contract. They noted that the contract itself provided that if the jute could not be imported from Pakistan, then the buyer will pay X% extra. In light of that, they said that there is no question of force majeure because the contract itself provides for a remedy of what happens when the seller is incapable of importing the jute, and therefore we will follow the contract. And one very interesting thing that was noted by the Supreme Court is that even if Section 56 for a moment were to apply, let us assume that the contract had become impossible. They note that Section 56 does not make a contract void ab initio, it only puts an end to performance of the contract. Now, again, this would at first blush seem like a distinction without a difference, but it is quite interesting because it means that if a contract which is entered into today is not impossible. So, for example, let us assume that there is a contract for supply of staff. It is an HR firm. They contract that they will supply X number of staff to a company ABC. Because of this lockdown, they are unable to do so. That does not mean that the contract was void ab initio. It does not mean that there were never any obligations under the contract. What it does mean is that the requirement to continue to supply the staff for the month of April, that comes to an end. And that was something that the Supreme Court held in categorical terms. Next, there's a 2001 judgment, Raymond Limited versus MP Electricity Board. In this particular case, there was a contact, as many factories and many industrial units have contacts with their electricity supply provider for a minimum payment, or an annual minimum payment and a monthly minimum bill. For some particular reason, Raymond was unable to utilize that amount of electricity during a particular month. And it was also alleged that due to certain natural calamities, the electricity board was also unable to continuously supply a particular voltage. So Raymond said that this constitutes force majeure. At the end of the day, it may be a government agency, the MP Electricity Board, it may be functioning under the Electricity Act, but it is still a contract to supply electricity, and it is still a contractual obligation to pay for it. So Raymond said that this is force majeure. They are unable to take advantage of the electricity supply during that period, and therefore they should not be obligated to pay for that minimum guarantee. The Supreme Court held some very interesting things. One, they held that the doctrine of frustration encapsulated in Section 56 is not necessarily universally applicable. They held that statutory contracts, especially contracts for supply of electricity, cannot be dealt with in the same manner, and therefore the doctrine of frustration has no applicability to these particular type of special contracts. Another thing they held was that a minimum guaranteed amount, that is unexceptionable. So if it is entered into the contract, it cannot be wriggled out of, regardless of whether there is force majeure or not. So essentially, the Supreme Court, and we will see this in the next judgment also, they said that statutory contracts and contracts in which the penalty or the result of non-performance is stipulated, they will be outside the purview of Section 56. Let's now take a look at the next one, because that is on similar names. Mary versus,
Ahmed,
sorry?
Ahmed, I have a question on Section 56 since you are dealing with this topic.
Yes, yes.
Section 56 excludes temporary impossibility.
Yes, it does.
Also, time is the essence of a contract.
Yes.
So, is it correct to say that in a time-sensitive contract, the permanence of impossibility is immaterial for the purpose of Section 56?
Yes, so that is actually something that we will be dealing with when we deal with force majeure in infrastructure context. But to put it as a short point, then yes, because if we see Section 56, it says that the contract needs to have become impossible. Of course, this may not mean that it can never be performed. It just means that in the reasonable future, in the foreseeable future, it has become incapable of performance. Now, this necessarily would imply that if the impossibility that is being claimed is temporary in nature, So for example, if due to the outbreak of war, there is a halt on import of cement or for 6 months, then it cannot be said that it is impossible to import cement, because it is only a temporary delay of 6 months. So if we see purely under section 56, the contract is no longer, the contract cannot be said to be affected by impossibility. Of course, if the time is an essence of the contract, then section 56 itself has no application, because then we have to look at section 55 of the Contract Act, which talks about when promises have to be discharged at a particular time and what happens if it is not possible to discharge them at a particular time. So that is something that we'll take a bit of a more deeper look in when we talk about infrastructure contracts, because what an argument that may come from a contractor, and an argument that a contractor may want to make, because this is an unprecedented scenario, the lockdown, is that a contract is not necessarily impossible to perform because of the lockdown, but to perform it within the parameters or within the timelines set out has become impossible during the lockdown. And we'll have to, of course, the courts will have to examine how valid this argument is. But as the law stands presently, section 56 would not be attracted to such a scenario, and we'd have to fall back on the general concepts of equity, and we'll have to fall back on the general concepts of how force majeure is described in that particular agreement. So that is something we look at when we deal with force majeure and infrastructure contracts. But let's just wrap up on general applicability of section 56. So in Mary versus State of Kerala, the contract, it was application for a license to grow something called tendu leaf. So it is a particular crop that requires license, I believe, from the government, from the state government. So for a particular district, the petitioner, the appellant, Mary, she had obtained a license to sell those leaves in that particular district, but she was not able to. So to obtain that license, you have to give an earnest money deposit. You have to pay a certain amount as license fees. She was not able to, after getting that license, she was not able to sell the leaves during that in that district, because there was a local law and order problem. People did not want that particular substance to be sold within that district because of religious sentiments. So she was never able to fulfill the terms of a license. Naturally, she applied for a refund of the earnest money deposit. She said that the contract is vitiated by force majeure. Because of the law and order situation, I was never able to perform my side of the contract. I was never able to exploit the license that was given to me. The government was unable to provide a safe environment in which I could sell those goods. So please refund the earnest money deposit, the license fees. The Supreme Court, after going through the subject matter and going through the law on the issue, said that it is not possible for that refund. They said that perhaps the agreement has become impossible, and perhaps otherwise section 56 would apply, but for the fact that the agreement itself contained a clause saying that in no circumstances will the earnest money deposit or the license fees be refunded, even if the license is not able to be exploited. They also relied on the fact that the statutory provisions relating to the grant of that license also contained a rule in the rules saying that the refund will never be given regardless of whether the person is able to sell the goods within the locality, and regardless of whether the performance of that license was impossible. Essentially, they said that it was a risk that the person is willing to take, and it is a business risk that the person has undertaken by accepting that license and by making payment of that license fee. So this further goes to show that the Supreme Court has taken the stand that where the contract itself provides for clauses relating to its impossibility or its inability to be performed, then section 56 has no application per se, and we have to be governed by the terms of the contract itself. Now, also somewhat related to the question of temporary issues, the case of in Continental Construction Company versus State of Madhya Pradesh. In this case, the Supreme Court was faced with the question that can an inordinate increase in the price of raw materials be construed as force majeure? So for example, during a calamity, the first things that always become more expensive are cement and steel. Any sort of international crisis or any sort of natural calamity, these are substances that always tend to increase in price. So a construction company obviously was going to face a bit of stress because all of its projects would get a lot more expensive. So they argued that since this increase in price is inordinate, it is not in the normal or natural course of things, it should be construed as a force majeure. It is something that was not foreseeable by the parties, and therefore it should invalidate the agreement and render the construction company impervious from any claims of damages or liquidated damages or anything else. The Supreme Court once again narrowly interpreted 56 and focused more on the terms of the contract and said that this is once again a business risk. It is a business risk that the parties took, and because of whatever reason they were unable to perform the contract, that will not put an end to it. The last case that I would really like to discuss is Shanti Vijayan Company versus Princess Fatima Fauzia. Now, this is quite frankly, this is a very interesting judgment for the scope of the issues that were dealt with. We, of course, will focus on one very small part, but from the standpoint of soap opera, it is quite interesting, a princess and her jewels. The problem in this was there was certain jewelry that was to be auctioned due to a family dispute. Its auction, which before it was to be auctioned, one of the family members had promised to sell it to a private party for a particular cost. But before they could sell it to that private party, one of the city civil courts, the Mofassil courts, had in fact passed an ad interim injunction preventing that sale. By the time the larger litigation was sorted and it was determined that in fact the person who wanted to sell that jewelry did have a right to sell the jewelry, the value had deteriorated because of the ad interim injunction. So the buyer of course wanted to purchase it at the same value, but the Supreme Court said that no, that cannot be done. The act of the court in this case was considered as a force majeure, rendering performance of that particular sale contract impossible. So it is not just a natural calamity, and this is the reason why this judgment is included. It is not just a natural calamity that would attract Section 56, but an impossibility due to a court process or some other day-to-day human-driven process can also come under the purview of Section 56. So these are some judgments that really do tell us what the Supreme Court intends the scope of Section 56 to be and how narrow it is actually to be construed. Now let us look at a standard force majeure clause that, for example, this is taken from the general conditions of contract from a railways agreement. But I think we can note that most force majeure clauses, especially in contracts relating to PSUs or government bodies, are generally on these lines. So it's with certain modifications, we'll just read it out. If at any time during the continuance of this contract, the performance is prevented or in part by either party of any obligation under this contract shall be prevented or delayed by reason of any war, hostility, acts of public enemy, civil commotion, sabotage, etc., etc. Then they can of course be prevented, provided notice of the happening of any such event is given by either party to the other within 30 days from the date of occurrence thereof. And neither party shall by reason of such event be entitled to terminate the contract, nor shall either party have any claim for damages against the other in respect of such non-performance of delay in performance, and works under the contract shall be resumed as soon as practical. Now, as we have noted earlier, if a contract itself provides for remedies or provides for the mechanism to be implemented in case the parties are unable to perform it, then we have to go by the terms of the contract and not by Section 56. So for example, to take this clause, if we assume that a person did not inform the other party about the impossibility or the difficulties in performance within 30 days from the date of the occurrence, then in fact that party will not be able to take advantage, and that party will not also be able to go to court and say Section 56 covers me, so forget the force majeure clause in the agreement, protect me under Section 56. That is also not possible because the agreement itself provides for the effect of non-performance. So now with that, I think we can look at some specific applications of force majeure. Let's start with leave and license agreements, and most of these will be simple actually. So now, as everybody I'm sure is aware, a leave and license agreement does not create any right in property. It is a pure license, or even some people will go to the extent of saying it is a pure easement. covered by the Easements Act. It is a license that is given to a person to access a certain property for some amount of time. Now, if we look at it from this perspective, there are two counter obligations. The obligation of the licensor is to provide the premises, and the obligation of the licensee is to pay for usage of the premises on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, however the agreement may be framed. Of course, subject to certain obligations of keeping the premises in good condition, etc. So now let us examine in this particular pandemic whether a party can take into account section 56 or whether a party is protected by it. So if we see from the licensor's perspective, if a licensor wants to say that the lockdown and the pandemic is a force majeure and therefore treat the leave and license agreement as having come to an end, the licensor possibly will not be able to say this because the licensor's only obligation is to provide the premises. And there is nothing in any of the notifications under the Disaster Management Act or the Epidemics Act that prevents a licensor from offering his premises for use. Granted, the licensee will not be able to actually use them because of the lockdown, but it cannot be force majeure from the side of the licensor. Similarly, the licensee may not be able to access the premises, but that is at the end of the day an option that the licensee procures through the license agreement. The licensee's main obligation is payment of the license fees. It is very tempting for a licensee to say that because of the overall reduction in business caused due to the lockdown, the economic conditions do no longer allow it to comply with its obligations of paying the license fees. But whether or not this will fly is also a difficult question, because we've seen in that judgment of the construction company of the state of Madhya Pradesh that an economic hardship cannot be force majeure. It is not impossibility. If, for example, the same company that claims economic hardship today suddenly finds itself in possession of a very valuable object and gets a windfall as a result, it's no longer impossible. So economic hardship can never be grounds for impossibility under section 56, at least not on an individual level. Perhaps if the economy as a whole is in a deep doldrums, then maybe a case can be made out, and that's something that the courts will have to consider, because reduction in revenue is always going to be a business risk, and that's the about it. Let's now see lease. Now, a lease agreement actually does create some sort of right in immovable property. A lease is defined as the transfer of an interest in immovable property. So lease agreements are covered under the Transfer of Property Act. And section 108E in fact talks about how a lease can come to an end if the property in question, again the subject matter of the agreement, that itself comes to an end. If it is destroyed by an act of God, then naturally the lease has to determine. If you take a building on lease and the building tomorrow falls down, then obviously the lease will have to be determined by force majeure. But if we take this particular aspect out of it, assume, for example, in the current pandemic, we're not thinking about a flood or a tornado or any such natural calamity which destroys the building. It's more a lockdown which has caused a revenue loss, economic loss, and in general hardships in utilizing the property. A lease can only be terminated in accordance with section 111 of the TOPA, the Transfer of Property Act, which provides the circumstances in which we can end a lease. And judgments upon judgments have held that when it comes to a lease, you have to look at only section 111 to determine how a lease comes to an end. You don't look at section 56 of the Contract Act. In fact, any provision of Contract Act that is contrary to section 111 is no longer applicable. So again, unless the ground for termination falls squarely under section 111, neither of the parties can really say that their performance of their obligations under the lease has now come to an end, because it is impossible, and therefore let us not continue with it. It has to be terminated under section 111. And this is frankly, of course there will be a note circulated later, but there are several judgments on this issue now that section 56 wouldn't apply to a lease. Now let's look at flat purchase agreements, because this is actually something quite interesting. Flat purchase agreements and joint venture agreements, joint development agreements. As we've stated earlier, the Real Estate Regulation Act does contain a provision about force majeure. Section 6, I believe, allows the developer to seek an extension of the completion of the project if a force majeure event occurs. And we might have seen in the news one particular developer who is coming up with a project in BKC in Mumbai has in fact wrote to the Real Estate Regulation Authority seeking an extension due to the lockdown. And perhaps the builder would have a point, because the lockdown has also made sure that there is no labor available to work on the buildings. In fact, if the developer had continued working on the building, it might have gone against the notifications under the Epidemics Act or the Disaster Management Act. So the Real Estate Regulation Act certainly talks about force majeure. But once again, we have to note that Section 56 would be precluded for two reasons. One, as we discussed some time ago with Om Prakash, that this is a temporary measure, and Section 56 only applies when the impossibility is either absolute or permanent, or is reasonably expected to be absolute or permanent. And the very fact that a developer would say he needs extension of 6 months or 1 year because of the lockdown goes to show that it is not an impossible event to perform his obligations, and therefore 56 would not apply. And you have, secondly, sorry, and this comes to the next point. Secondly, that extension is dependent on the view of the Real Estate Regulation Authority. So they need to approve the extension, which is one more reason why Section 56 can't apply, because 56 does not depend upon the intention of the parties to an agreement. So this is an external body that determines whether or not the force majeure is genuine, whether or not it is warranted, and therefore will allow the force majeure. Now let's talk about specifically from the purchaser's point of view, a flat purchase agreement. So a flat purchase agreement, and this is quite contrary to what we usually assume, a flat purchase agreement by itself does not give any direct rights in an immovable property. In fact, if we see the Real Estate Regulation Act, Section 17 talks about the liability of the promoter, the owner or the developer, to convey the property. And it is noteworthy that the developer will not convey an individual flat to a flat purchaser. In fact, the obligation of the developer is to convey the overall property to this organization, either the society or company, etc., of the flat purchases that is formed. So a flat purchaser individually does not get a right in the immovable property even at the time of registration. This is something that has gone through a lot of judicial debate, of course, but in the recent judgment of Bombay High Court in Vaidehi Akash, they have Justice Gupta has in fact gone through this at length and ultimately held that the obligations of a developer are dependent on the development agreement, apart from many other things held. And a flat purchaser who enters into a agreement to purchase a flat in the free sale component of a redevelopment project has no right to insist on the supply of that flat even after the redevelopment agreement is terminated. This also follows from this principle that under RERA, it is the conveyance of the entire property to the society of the flat purchasers that is the obligation of the builder. So if we think about it from this perspective, the flat purchasers are of course left with very little remedy. If they feel that it is now become impossible for the developer to perform the obligations, they must take recourse to the terms of the purchase agreement in itself, because again, this may or may not come under impossibility under Section 56. But the alternative solution, and in fact, if the developer has flouted the terms of the flat purchase agreement and the development agreement, as the case may be, the flat purchasers can take recourse to the amended Section 20 of the Specific Relief Act. Now, I'm sure most of us are aware that Specific Relief Act was amended in the year 2018. And Section 20, which earlier talked about the discretion of a court in granting specific performance, was amended and a new Section 20 was inserted, which talks about something called substituted performance. Now, substituted performance is essentially when the person who was promised something, in this case, the person was promised the construction of a flat. If that obligation is not being discharged by the promisor, the person can step in, take the project away from the developer and entrust it either to a third party contractor or do it themselves. And in such a scenario, they won't be able to claim specific performance from the developer. So naturally, if they finish the construction of the building themselves, they can't ask the developer to complete it, but they can defray the cost incurred by them from the developer in the form of compensation. So rather than section 56, which will frankly get a flat purchaser nowhere, the better remedy would be for the society or the flat purchaser to seek substituted performance in terms of the amended provisions of specific relief act. So again, in terms of a flat purchase agreement, perhaps section 56 may not have great applicability, either from the side of the developer who is bound by RERA, or from the side of the flat purchaser who admittedly would not have any concrete rights in the immovable property in question, and therefore naturally will not be able to use force majeure to get anything except for compensation. Now let us talk about infrastructure projects, because this is certainly going to be an issue. From anecdotal evidence, it does seem that major infrastructure projects are already at a huge delay because of this lockdown. And in all cases, the delay cannot be extended. So now, sorry, getting back to what Om Prakash had pointed out about temporary delays. So let us contrast two types of agreements. Let us contrast a simple agreement for suppose construction of a warehouse, which is also an infrastructure project. Now, construction of a warehouse may or may not be time sensitive. The agreement may in fact contain provisions saying that it must be constructed by November, for example. But it isn't. Because of this lockdown, the 3 months of work on the warehouse could not be done, and the construction goes from beyond November to possibly January or February. Now, in such a scenario, the contract may provide for a mechanism for delay in cases of circumstances beyond the control, and the parties may agree to it. Or let us suppose that the employer does not agree to it, and the contractor claims 56. Now, keeping aside all of the other aspects of the applicability of section 56, where the contract itself provides a mechanism, let us examine on pure equity the two sides of the argument. The employer will say that it's irrelevant what has happened. It was on the turnkey basis. They were to provide a completed warehouse by November. They have not. The contractor will say that we wanted to provide the warehouse by November. There's no question of us being behind schedule before March, but because of the lockdown, we were pushed back by 3 months. The court may say that, okay, fine, it certainly was something, a scenario beyond anybody's control. But the court may also apply section 55 of the Contract Act. And I'll just open that and read that out. I'm sorry, I haven't had put up a slide for section 55, but I'll just read it out. Effect of failure to perform at fixed time in contract in which time is essential. When a party to a contract promises to do a certain thing at or before a specified time, or certain things at or before specified time, and fails to do any such thing at or before the specified time, the contract, or so much of it has not been performed, becomes voidable at the option of the promisee if the intention of the parties was that time should be essence of the contract. Effect of such failure when time is not essential. If it was not the intention of the parties that time should be of the essence of the contract does not become voidable by the failure to do such thing at or before the specified time, but the promisee is entitled to compensation from the promissor for any loss occasioned to him by such failure. Effect of acceptance of performance at time other than agreed upon. If in the case of a contract voidable on account of promisor's failure to perform his promise at the time agreed, the promisee accepts performance of such promise at any time other than what is agreed, the promisee cannot claim compensation. So this is essentially when time is of the essence of the contract. But why I started with the example of the warehouse is this may be a case where the court takes into account this particular exceptional circumstance, because if we truly think about it, this is unprecedented. I don't think in the history of at least I haven't come across anything after independence where the economy is not only shut down, but it is an offense to in fact perform such an agreement, such as an infrastructure development agreement. So the court may, and this is something that will be tested, the court may apply principles of equity and say that notwithstanding the fact that the parties had agreed upon something in the contract in terms of a timeline, and notwithstanding the fact that there was in fact a clause in the agreement relating to impossibility of performance, the fact still remains that this was something that was unimaginable on the side of the parties, and therefore they may apply section 56. But there is a big hitch in this also. let us take the example of another type of infrastructure agreement. Let us take the example of an agreement, for example, dredging of a port, or for import of a vessel, or for creation of a dry dock. Naturally, as many people would appreciate, these kind of projects would have to be completed in a particular season. And unfortunately for us, the pandemic finds itself having hit just before the monsoon season. So in fact, if dredging is not complete by June, there's no point going ahead with it in June and July, because monsoon will start and all of that work will have been for nothing. So essentially, the court will, in such a scenario, be faced with a case where it cannot apply equity, because it is not a question of the parties not wanting to perform it anymore, but it is a question of the parties being, if the performance being done today would not have any consequence. So I'll just quickly go through a few points in this. There is, of course, a circular of 19th February, but that circular only talks about supply chain. So it is still unclear for government procurement agencies and for PSUs as to whether this particular pandemic can be a force majeure for every eventuality. Certainly, the government has said it can be a force majeure for supply chains, for import of certain goods from China, etc. Now, can the agreement be terminated? The agreement can be terminated in accordance with its own provisions. So most agreements will have detailed provisions about force majeure, about its termination, about in case of delay when it can be terminated. If the stipulations under that clause are met, then as we have discussed, the Supreme Court today, as the law stands, Supreme Court has said Section 56 has no application and the agreement can be terminated. Next question is whether liquidated damages can be obtained. Now, if we go strictly by those judgments of the Supreme Court we dealt with earlier, then yes, the employer will be able to levy liquidated damages, because it doesn't matter for what reason the performance was delayed. The Supreme Court has said if the contract provides for a penalty, or contract provides for damages to be paid for non-performance, then it will have to be paid. It does sound rather harsh given the kind of lockdown that we're facing, but today that is the law as it stands of the Supreme Court. Then the right of the contractor to claim compensation. So if in the warehouse example or in the dredging example, if the contractor has managed to dredge, suppose 50% of the port, can he claim compensation for that amount? Now, there is an old British judgment which seems to have been followed in India in the Supreme Court, saying that where there is a project or where there's a contract for a particular project, in this case for dredging of the entire port, for removal of X number of tons of silt, then a contractor who becomes incapable of continuing or completing the contract but has performed some portion of it cannot ask for compensation for that portion either, because the contract was for dredging of the entire port, so he must dredge the entire port or not take any compensation at all. Again, this seems particularly harsh given the current scenario, but we will have to see whether the courts deviate from this principle. Now let us go to, just one second, sorry. Joint development agreements. Now, joint development agreements are a form of, in fact, infrastructure agreements, because joint development agreements do not create any rights in the immovable property. So even if a property owner and a builder, for example, collaborate to construct a building, the builder does not get any rights in the immovable property in question. It's, again, we've talked about the Vaidhi Akash judgment. There are several other judgments which talk about this aspect, that a builder is appointed to develop the property. So since the builder does not have any rights in the immovable property, he is a contractor just like any other. It's a service provider. And therefore, the same considerations of force majeure will apply as if any other service provider. So if the contract is silent, which in this day and age it very rarely is, if the contract is silent as to force majeure, then section 56 to apply, the contractor will have to, or the developer will have to show that this lockdown has caused an absolute impossibility to perform the agreement as opposed to a temporary impossibility, and therefore section 56 should apply in full vigor. Again, the developer may not be entitled to compensation. This is something that has been held in the past by Bombay High Court. And the developer, and of course we can take reference to what we discussed previously, that this since the developer did not complete the project, he cannot claim compensation for part performance. The property owner, again, can either seek substituted performance or can seek one of the other remedies for compensation, etc. Now, material adverse change. This is, we're going to only go over this briefly because it is very dependent on the wording of the clause. But a material adverse change clause is usually found in transactions such as mergers, acquisitions, etc., where during the negotiations and before the transaction is complete, it is specified that if there is a material adverse change to the circumstances around the transaction, then it can be cancelled. This is of particular significance today because we may note the RBI governor made a speech a couple of weeks ago, which is uploaded to the RBI website, in which a very bleak picture of the economic outlook has been painted. In fact, he has said that the recession is likely, and he's quoted IMF and other agencies, and he said that the recession that may happen, uh, perhaps as a result of the lockdown, or at least perhaps arising out of circumstances connected to the lockdown, may be unprecedented in its scope. So a company that was valued at X before the pandemic started may now only be valued at half of it. Of course, because this is so dependent on the facts of each case and the wordings of the clause, we'll have to see how the courts react. But I think a case can certainly be made out that this would be a material adverse change. The last point, and a point that we're certainly going to see a lot of litigation, is about bank guarantees. I'll quickly, all of us are aware of the law relating to bank guarantees. There are umpteen number of judgments: Adani Agrofresh, Reliance Cellulose, Terry Hydrodam. A bank guarantee is not to be easily injuncted. In fact, you cannot obtain a injunction against the invocation of a bank guarantee except in two cases. And I've said those particular scenarios out. One is fraud, and the second is irretrievable injury. Now, the favorite argument that we usually see in bank guarantee matters in relation to fraud is that the invocation of the guarantee was fraudulent because perhaps almost the entire project was completed. Perhaps it is alleged that the employer did not give certain permissions, etc. But what has been held time and time again by the courts is that the fraud needs to not be in the invocation of the guarantee, but the fraud needs to be in the obtaining of the bank guarantee. So to put it into context of this particular pandemic, suppose the contractor writes to the employer, the principal employer, saying that because of the lockdown, I am unable to complete this project in the month of April. Therefore, I need 2 more months to complete it by June. And the employer chooses to invoke the bank guarantee, saying that you've already acted in contravention of the agreement, and therefore we are encashing the bank guarantee. Can the contractor go to court and say this is fraud because the employer knows very well that in today's scenario he cannot perform the contract? The judgment so far, and the one we worked on with the law point in a particular case relating to an offshore oil rig, the judgments so far are very clear, emphatically clear, that fraud cannot relate to the invocation of the guarantee, but must be such to invalidate the guarantee as a contract. So merely because it is alleged that the employer, sorry, is fraudulently encashing the guarantee will not be enough to get an injunction, which leaves us with the second ground of irretrievable injury. So what is irretrievable injury? Again, the bank guarantee is meant to be a independent contract which is encashed. And if a person feels that the bank guarantee is unfairly encashed, they can seek back the money from the person who benefited. Irretrievable injury is when the person goes to court and is able to show that that remedy of succeeding in the case and therefore taking back the money, that remedy will be defeated due to some external circumstance. Now let us take a look at the present pandemic, irretrievable injury. So as we have seen, there have been some FDI restrictions now from investment in China. So the if because of the new restrictions, a person can show that if at all this bank guarantee is encashed, they will never be able to recover that money because of the restrictions that have been imposed, then it is an irretrievable injury and they may be entitled to an injunction. Of course, in today's day and age, thanks to IBC, the concept of irretrievable injury does need expansion because one default is enough to take away a company from a promoter altogether. So that is also an irretrievable injury, which has not yet been fully examined. But the irretrievable injury must not be to the status of the person against whom the bank guarantee is being invoked. Yes, they will lose money, but the irretrievable injury needs to be in the ability of the person to recover that amount from the person who benefited from the invocation of the bank guarantee. So that there have been some recent judgments. In fact, the Delhi High Court in a couple of judgments, one is Halliburton versus Vedanta and one is Ashwini Mehra versus IOCL. In both these judgments, the Delhi High Court recently, while conducting the proceedings of video conference, they have injuncted the encashment of the bank guarantee. And I'm told that in 2 cases in Bombay High Court also it has happened. But we should note that in all of those cases, the facts of the matter were not gone into. In fact, the judgments expressly note that it is purely a temporary measure to prevent encashment of the bank guarantee, and the merits of the case have not been examined. So we can't really take much guidance in terms of a binding precedent from that. A few days ago, the Supreme Court also examined the issue in a case of Indrajit Power, in which a contractor who was to complete an infrastructure project applied to the Supreme Court for a restraint against the encashment of the bank guarantee, but which was refused because the Supreme Court said that the contractor was already delayed on the project even before the lockdown started, and therefore the contractor had absolutely no right to claim any sort of equities or to claim irretrievable injury. But we should have a note of caution. There is a 2001 Delhi High Court judgment which specifically states that force majeure cannot prevent invocation of a bank guarantee. And the logic behind that was simple. The Delhi High Court said that force majeure only invalidates the contract or only makes the contract void which relates to the performance. So a contract between A and B for the supply of certain goods or for the construction of a building, that may be invalidated by force majeure. But the bank guarantee is an independent contract with A and B and C being the bank. The force majeure cannot possibly invalidate this independent contract of the bank guarantee, and therefore the bank will continue to be liable to honor the terms of its guarantee. So this is a note of caution we must see, because the standard for injunction, obtaining an injunction against invocation of a bank guarantee is very high, it's very harsh. So we should not take it for granted that just because the Delhi High Court has and the Bombay High Court have injuncted the invocation of bank guarantees in a few cases, we shouldn't take it for granted that this is a precedent or this will always be followed. But we will, of course, keep a lookout, because certainly there will be instances where the scope of irretrievable injury is tested, especially in light of this lockdown. So I think that now we can open it up to question of answers. I'd really like to thank Ayush and Shivani for taking all of my disjointed thoughts and putting it in the form of a presentation. And I'm especially thankful to everybody for listening patiently to my incessant ramblings. But I would certainly love to address any questions that have arisen.